So if you'd like to start just by saying who you are and where you're working, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Right, so I'm John Abraham at King's College London. I'm a professor, for what it's worth. So I've been working on testing and regulation of pharmaceuticals for it's 30 years now. I'm shocked to say. I'm a somewhat unusual academic in the sense that I work on pharmaceutical testing and regulation from the location of a social scientist and a political scientist, but in the course of doing it, or at least doing it the way I do, I have become an expert in all sorts of aspects of drug testing, including toxicology, pharmacoepidemiology, clinical trials, and all these sorts of things. But I don't actually do any of them, so I'm not a white coat scientist, if you like. But I review a lot of evidence that is submitted to the Food and Drug Administration because it's the most transparent in the world, I think, still. But also other regulatory agencies, Sweden, the UK, and so on. So I review the evidence and the claims that are made by various stakeholders and scientists, including the regulatory scientists, including the industrial scientists, and so on. When material comes into the public domain through court cases, I also review internal pharmaceutical company evidence and communications and scientific data, which otherwise would not have become publicly available. So I don't know if some of you here might remember the big halcyon controversy, the controversy over the safety of halcyon. And it wasn't very good news for the BBC because the BBC Panorama programme was sued by Upjohn manufacturers for the claims they made in a programme. But the consequence of that libel case meant that absolutely masses of evidence came into the public domain because the court case, of course, was in the public domain through the Royal Courts of Justice. So I analysed all of this material and then made judgments about the quality of the regulatory decision making. I've done that in the Operin controversy, which was a big drug disaster here in the UK in the 1980s, and also the Practolol disaster, which some of you might remember from the 1970s. Of course, we're all aware of the thalidomide case, but it's rather different because it predated any formal regulatory system, and of course that's also the case with the initial approval of Primados, which is, I guess, what we're here to discuss today. So that's what I've done, that's what I do, that's my expertise. So I was asked by various people involved in the Primados controversy to review the expert working group report of the MHRA. Is it okay to call these things by their acronyms, or do I need to? Everybody knows what the MHRA is. Good. So I did that, and that's kind of most of what I submitted to you in my written submission. Maybe I'll just summarise my view, and then you can ask me more if you want to. But so my feeling is that there is in the content of that expert working group review, there is evidence of toxicological problems with the drug. So there is animal toxicology evidence suggesting harm from taking Primados, teratogenicity evidence to be precise. There's also evidence of toxicity and teratogenicity in the epidemiological studies. There's also evidence of it in the spontaneous adverse drug reaction reporting. And there, of course, is evidence, which is the claims made by the alleged victims who claim to have been injured by taking the drug. So we don't have prospective randomized controlled clinical trials, which is the golden standard for trying to impute causality between a drug and an adverse event. But it seems to me, on the basis of the evidence that the expert working group reviewed, it was wrong to conclude that causality should be ruled out. So the conclusion that there is no causality was an incorrect conclusion, which is not to say that there was definitive evidence of causality, because I don't believe there was definitive evidence of causality in the material that they reviewed. The other point I would say is that since that review, there have been some developments which shouldn't be ignored. One is Neil Ferguson in Aberdeen has done some studies claiming that Primados is toxic, teratogenic, I should say, to be precise, teratogenic to fish. And there's also been Carl Hennigan's meta-analysis, who obviously you've heard from because I met him coming out the door. And his meta-analysis, which I've looked at and which seems sound to me, is saying that, as far as I read it, and of course you've heard his own evidence, so you should take his evidence on that above mine, but as I read it, he's saying that on the balance of probabilities there is a causal link, which is a stronger statement than I made when I reviewed the initial expert working group analysis. There's another observation I would make, and again you can ask me much more about this if you want to, which is that it is certainly the case that, of course, there was no formal medicines regulation in the UK when Primados was first introduced onto the market in the 1950s. But it is true that it was possible to do teratogenic testing at that time. And it is also true, in my view, that there was sufficient ethical sense and ethical intelligence to suggest that the drug company should have done animal teratogenicity testing on the drug before putting it on the market to be given to humans. Now, when I looked at the expert working group of the IMMDSReview report and its references, and of course nearly all, if not all, of its references to the company's teratogenicity testing were not published. But we'll come to that in a second. But so I can only refer to the report itself. But even on the basis of its references to those studies, it looked as if there was no animal teratogenicity testing done until the 1960s. In other words, this drug was put on the market before it had ever been tested in animals for teratogenicity. I regard that as appallingly unethical, even by the standards of the 1950s. There is then the question of whether or not it was illegal. As I said in my written submission, clearly it was not in violation of medicines regulations law, because none existed at that time. Whether it was illegal by reference to general consumer product safety law and the duty of a manufacturer to care about such things is something I don't know the answer to, but I certainly think it should be investigated, and it should have been investigated by the MHRA. The other issue I think that concerned me, and it's sort of implied in my written submission, is that I wasn't clear, and I certainly didn't derive any reassurance from the MHRA's expert working group report, which I'm just going to call EWG from now on. It certainly wasn't clear from the EWG report that they had made strident efforts to ensure that the company had submitted to them all the relevant data. There was no discussion of that issue. There was no discussion of what steps they had taken to ensure that the company had not submitted merely a selective set of data. It wasn't clear that we had comprehensive data, and it wasn't clear why the data that was submitted was continued to be protected on commercial grounds and withheld from public view. For two reasons. First, given that the drug is now off the market, what possible justification could there be on commercial grounds? And secondly, in cases like this, the public interest in safety should always override the commercial interests of private companies. And I'll make a more general observation, which is that this happens in the context of decades upon decades of extensive and undesirable secrecy within the UK pharmaceutical regulatory system. You probably know that when the Medicines Act in 1968 was first introduced, the work of the Committee on Safety of Medicines and various other all other expert advisory committees to the Department of Health at that time were covered by not only by the 1911 Official Secrets Act, but by Section 118 of the Medicines Act. So there was a double blank of secrecy preventing any public discussion or public disclosure of the workings of the regulatory agencies. The MHRA, I think it was 2003 that Tony Blair gave us the UK Freedom of Information Act. So, the MHRA has come some way since then because of the UK Freedom of Information Act, but the UK Freedom of Information Act, in my view, remains too weak. It's too easy for the regulators still to retain evidence and data that should be in the public domain so that we can have proper scientific evaluation. One of the fundamental principles of science is open ability to scrutinize the claims made by fellow scientists, whether they work in industry or in the government. So we have a real problem in this country. It's not confined to this country. It's better in some other countries and it's worse in some others. But we have a real problem in this country with not just transparency, but the idea of science, and particularly industrial science and government science, being publicly accountable. And I think that, to some extent, characterises some of the issues that, in a broader sense, that we have to do within the Primadose controversy. The final point I'll make is one of justice, and that is, irrespective of whether or not one can definitively identify a causal link between Primadose and various severe adverse events for the people who took it, there is clearly a responsibility upon the government, and I would argue the manufacturers as well, to deliver justice in these cases because of the inadequacy of the testing of the product before it was given to these people. Now you might argue, well, the government can't be blamed for the fact that there was no regulatory oversight at that time because we didn't have the Medicines Act and we didn't have any formal regulation. But from my own research, which has been published in a few locations some years ago, it's clear that the British government knew about the problem of not having any drug safety regulation, particularly in the light of the 1937 elixir sulfanilamide disaster in the United States, which prompted the US government to introduce drug safety regulation. It's clear that the British government knew about that and decided to do nothing. And I think in that sense, historically, the British government has a duty of negligence in terms of justice towards these people because it did not introduce drug safety regulation at that time. 1968 was far too late, and then we waited 3 years for it even to be implemented. Now, just as a final comment, because I'm sure you're fed up listening to me, thalidomide happened in 1961. In the United States, the FDA strengthened their regulations by 1962. It took us until 1968 to get the Medicines Act, and then we gave the industry 3 years to get used to the idea by saying it wouldn't be implemented until 1971. All of this is lax, and it points to an inadequate response to the problems of drug safety by the British regulatory system and the British governments over some historical time. I think to understand what's happened in this controversy, you have to have some understanding of this, more fundamental problem that the British government has had with transparent and publicly accountable drug safety regulation.
Can I just say, I think one of the worries with Primados was when it was first introduced. I think there was a difficulty, wasn't there, that it was also used for abortions and for family planning and for all those issues. And wasn't there a concern that if they made it very public, then the population would be extremely worried, and that actually it could result in adverse effects for a lot of women?
There may have been that concern, but in my opinion, that sort of concern is always unfounded.
Yeah.
So one hears, and you can see it in the internal documents of governments when they come out into the public domain, you can see experts, government scientists and regulators frequently saying things, well, we shouldn't tell the public about these risks because it will alarm them. Or in the argument you're making, it might even cause some harm. But my view is that's never an adequate argument. It's better that the public knows what the risks are and that they can then make decisions on the basis of those risks, assuming the drug's going to be left on the market. Remember, it would be a slightly different argument with a sort of breakthrough cancer drug, but this is a pregnancy testing drug. So the benefits are really minimal for that indication, at any rate.
I think as well as that though, the two core ingredients were used in oral contraceptives, and I think that was one of the concerns at the time, as Julie was saying, is that oral contraceptive use, people would be concerned. So although yes, as a pregnancy test, absolutely. However, the active ingredients were in other preparations as well.
But it remained on the market well into the 1970s, into the mid-70s, being used, even if not recommended, being used as a pregnancy test. The fact that it was being used by as a pregnancy test way into the 1970s is something that would have been recorded, and certainly should have been recorded, by the what was then the Medicines Division tracking system, post-marketing surveillance systems. They must have known people were taking it as a pregnancy test. So in that context, it's clear that the warnings...
How would they have known people were taking it as a pregnancy test as opposed to using it for its other indication?
Because, well...
So it was prescribed for secondary amenorrhea as well?
Yeah, it would be so it would be an unusual tranche of yellow cards that didn't inform about why the drug was taken. So when doctors, can I assume people are familiar with the yellow card system? Okay, so when doctors fill out a yellow card yellow card report, which is a suspicion that the drug has caused the adverse event, they will generally, if not always, but I couldn't swear that they do it always, but they will generally specify why they were giving the patient the drug. So their tracking systems would have that data, and given that they had that data, they should have been much more proactive in warning against its use in that way, and indeed withdrawing it from the market for that indication, and really being much more proactive about it.
Can I just ask you ethically to go a bit further on what Sonia said? Suppose that giving publicity to its possible teratogenic effects led to a complete withdrawal of oral contraceptives across the world. The consequences of that would be pretty horrendous for women, wouldn't it?
Okay, so why would Why would one decide to?
Because they both contain progesterone and estrogens.
Yeah, but they're being used for different purposes. I mean, this is like saying, if you have an ingredient used for one disease where there's no evidence that it's a. I mean, so. I'm trying to think of an example.
I can't.
I mean, if you think of, you have drugs that are developed to treat some diseases, right? But actually, subsequently, they're found to be effective to treat another disease, and that's how they're marketed. Yes. So the idea that it would be okay to keep marketing them for the diseases for which there is no efficacy, it would be.
No, I agree
absurd.
with that bit of it.
Okay. The same argument applies. The same argument applies to safety.
It's that if you know that if you say, well, we're drawing this drug because we're using it as pregnancy tests, and we don't need to, but we're really concerned
we
that
think
it might have some teratogenic effects.
Yeah. Then
people are going to say, well, it contains norepinephrine and epidiol. So what does this pregnancy test contain? Now, I know the dose is entirely different. I'm just concerned that this was the days of social media and all that. But it's in the ethical argument, that's all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't change my view on the basis of that argument. So what I would say to that argument is, it's up to the regulatory agencies to up their game in terms of precise and adequate communication. And in particular, if in relation to contraceptives, so the first thing I have to say is the Committee on Safety of Medicines in the 70s was doing reviews about the carcinogenicity and the teratogenicity of contraceptives. So they were already concerned about that issue anyway. And with some contraceptives, there is reason to have some concerns. So my view is that you should tell people about what the evidence says.
So it's not a valid argument, basically.
No, I mean, it's only a valid argument if the regulators or who is trying to communicate the risks are really rubbish at communication and scare people because they don't make proper distinctions and so on between things like dosage and benefits and use. And actually, this is something that we really need to improve on as well. So
I'm trying to put myself into the minds of the people who, as you said, are recorded as saying, well, we mustn't worry the public.
Well, I think that's something that has been said by regulators at that time, is still said by regulators today about many of these sorts of issues. And I think in some cases we can take it at face value as a genuine concern. I think in other cases one could take it as a rationalisation for inaction which is motivated by other concerns and other interests and so on. But if we take it at face value, then sometimes that's a concern. What I would suggest from my own research is it's not very persuasive as the underlying explanation for many of these problems, because in nearly every case I've looked at, those sorts of concerns are marshalled to protect the maintenance of the drug on the market. So I think there are other kinds of forces at work. I think that the secrecy, I think, is largely about protecting commercial and industrial interests and the institutional interests of the regulators. I don't believe it's primarily about protecting the interests of consumers and patients, though I don't discount that as a possibility in some minority of instances.
Can I just say that I think I'd be very surprised if people did not agree totally with you that we have to be open and honest and truthful. And we absolutely agree with that. I think the majority of the population do, and we would certainly want to think deeply about that when we're doing our review. But I just was trying to think about what it was like in the 60s, 50s, whatever, when this particular medication was introduced. And I really think at that time there was a tremendous feeling, especially among very concerned clinicians, GPs, others. And I can think of a very personal instance where someone was dying, and the clinician said, we mustn't ever tell them they're dying, they've got to have hope. And so we're actually going to go on talking about how they're going to live their lives when everybody, the family, everybody else knew. So there was a feeling, I think, in those days of a very different attitude from clinicians to the individual patients, and that may well have gone across to whole populations. So it's difficult for us because when we're dealing with something that is so historical, that we have to think about what were the attitudes, and you as a sociologist will certainly know a lot about that. What were the attitudes at that time? And so we are searching for the truth of what happened then. But I think we have to think a little bit about the context of what the attitudes were like in those years gone by.
I agree we should put it in a good historical context, and particularly we're looking at something that happened in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Well, not all of it happened then, of course, some consequences happened later. But, so first of all, my heart is warmed to hear that you think that most of the population agree with my analysis. But since we're talking about history, I would say to you that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and 2000s, which I guess all counts as history, the UK regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical industry have fought tooth and nail at every turn to prevent greater transparency and public accountability of the pharmaceutical regulatory system. So it's not, and that goes right through the decades. So, that section of the population certainly doesn't share my view. And I think even to this day, the UK regulatory authorities would resist the kind of extensive public access to regulatory decision making that exists even in the US. And the US system falls far short of what I'd like to see. So in the US system, the regulatory decision making process enters the public domain once the decision is made, but it is essentially secreted before that, except with the one exception of expert advisory committee hearings, which happen in public. Now, that would be vastly more transparent than the US system. Coming now to attitudes of clinicians. Okay, so clinicians and their interaction with patients and consumers. If we're talking about those kinds of clinician practitioners, then maybe they did have these sorts of different attitudes that you're referring to. And I don't mean this as any disrespect to clinicians, but I'm not sure how much that matters. The people who really know about pharmaceuticals are the drug manufacturers and all the clinicians that they bring into their purview to conduct clinical trials, which of course didn't happen with Primados, but all the people in the purview of the company developing the drug that they get to help them develop the drug, they know a lot about the drug. And the people who work inside the regulatory agencies, either as expert advisors or as full-time civil servants, who review the data submitted by the companies, they're the people who know the data about the drug. Doctors prescribing stuff hopefully read what we would what we call in Europe the summary product of characteristics, what you call in the US the label. Hopefully they read that if they're good doctors. That's pretty much all they know, except for over time, their experiential knowledge of prescribing, which is partly why, actually, on the whole, older drugs tend to be safer than new drugs, because there is this additional knowledge that doctors gain through experience. So, but clinicians' attitudes, I'm not sure how significant they are to the decision-making process here. Of course, you can argue that many of the expert advisors to the regulatory agencies are themselves clinicians, but they're clinicians who have come into that position from a particular perspective. So attitudes have changed, but when you look at the cutting edge of decision making by the companies and by the regulatory authorities, and I refer you back, and I can send you my published work on Practilol if you want, I refer you back to the Practilol disaster, which occurred in the 1970s. The view of not being very transparent and the view also of not being proactive in warning the public, the view of acting slowly, in a nutshell, giving the drug the benefit of the doubt. In other words, saying, well, you know, it's probably better to keep this drug on the market. There are these claims about it has benefits and so on, and so maybe they outweigh the safety. This is a really pervasive problem, and it flies in the face of the objective scientific evidence.
But hang on a second, Practilol was on the market for quite a long time afterwards, because it did take quite a long time for the sclerosing symptoms to appear in some of the patients, and it wasn't instantaneous.
No, it wasn't instantaneous, but it was on the market for a long time after
And
the very severe adverse events were identified, and they were very rare types.
They were very
events.
rare, and I think that was why it took quite a long time, as my understanding of it, and there's not a lot of information about Practilol out there, but my understanding was it took quite a while to attribute, because it was both rare and because it wasn't necessarily instantaneous in terms of time taking.
It certainly wasn't instantaneous, but the fact that it was rare, I think many pharmacoepidemiologists and people involved in spontaneous adverse drug reaction monitoring would say that actually that should help you identify it.
Yeah.
Because rather like thalidomide, it was really clear that this was specific to this drug. There were, and I would argue, and I've published that the UK regulators should have acted to withdraw Practilol from the market much faster, and you see in many of these cases, and it's not actually. I don't think this is true in Primidose. It's a more complex kind of argument in Primidose, but you see the argument that, yes, there are these safety problems, but maybe the benefits outweigh the risks, but actually that's not what the evidence showed. Didn't show it in the case of the operant disaster, didn't show it in the case of the Practilol disaster, and it certainly doesn't show it in the case of using Primidose as a pregnancy test.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Can I just ask one thing back to the EWG?
Sure.
I think when you wrote to us, you talked about conflicts of interest.
Yes.
And non-personal conflicts of interest in particular.
Yes.
I was interested in that. Would you be able to briefly expand on your concerns?
Well, I mean, these things are, I think they're reasonable. I think the categories are fairly reasonably defined. So personal interests would be, if you hold consultancies in a company, or shares. So you receive consultancies from a company, or you hold shares in a company, or something of that nature. So essentially, money that you can put in your pocket. Right? Non-personal interests refer to, for example, you might be in receipt of a grant from a pharmaceutical company. So you can't put that money in your pocket, but it's good for your position, probably within your institution. It's probably good for your career and that sort of thing. So these would be non-personal interests. But then you have, and this is the thing that I raised in my written submission that I wasn't clear about what people were asked. It wasn't clear to me whether people were asked, do you have conflicts of interest with Bayer, the manufacturers, or do you have conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry? Obviously, these are two different questions. So you can say, no, I have absolutely no conflicts of interest with Bayer, but you might have huge conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry more generally. And I think it's inadequate merely to ask, do you have conflicts of interest with Bayer? Because, no, I'm not imputing anything specific to the members of the expert working group by saying this, because I would need to have more detail in order to analyse that. But I will make the general observation that it is often the case that people who have conflicts of interest with some companies in the pharmaceutical industry may quite likely have such a conflict of interest with a specific company in the future, or expect to have such a conflict of interest in the future, or more generally hold a sympathetic view of all pharmaceutical companies relative to somebody who has no conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry at all. You understand what the point I'm making? Mm-hmm. So therefore we need to ask the right questions about conflicts of interest. That's not to say I'm arguing conflicts of interest determined one particular conclusion or another of the expert working group, but we need it to be precise and clear, and the expert working group appendices about conflicts of interest did not offer that level of clarity in my view, and they should have done.
Thank you very much. Anything you'd like to ask of us?
I suppose, yes, I'm curious to know how much you are going to investigate the sort of adequacy of our drug regulatory system around things like public accountability and secrecy. Is that something that you will?
I'm sure there are a whole lot of issues that we're going to be exploring when we're coming to write our report. Yeah. And clearly today's been very helpful to us. Thank you so much for coming. It's been really, really useful.
Great.
And thought-provoking. Thank you very much.
Okay.